I'm Mary Galvin. I'm the Dean of the College of Science here at Notre Dame. I've been here about 7 months, and I really appreciate Scott including me in this. It's an honor to be here with this distinguished panel. I want to make a few remarks, then I will introduce each of the panelists. They'll make remarks. Then I really want to have an open discussion about this topic. It's really critical, as most of you know. I think this is, as a conference, is timely because of the encyclical. As others have said, the encyclical said that climate change is a problem that can no longer be left to future generations. When it comes to care of our common home, we are living at a critical moment, and that's clearly true. But it's also a huge challenge to bring the standard of living of undeveloped countries up to ours without really impeding the ability of future generations to have and maintain this standard. I have to be honest, I am a scientist. I've spent some time in government at the Department of Energy and at NSF. When I did that, one of my tasks was developing research plans for carbon capture. And it's led me to a bias to think that that energy is really key to solving this problem. When you give people in developing countries energy, if you give a village that has no electricity energy, you give them lights to read by at night, to get education. You give them refrigerators that store medicine and food and raise their standards of living. So I'm being very honest. My bias is if we don't solve the energy, we don't solve anything. And energy is critical to cleaning up water. Now, that said, it's a big, big problem. We have to find a way to allow the developing countries to get non-carbon-based energy while we reduce our dependence on carbon energy. That's not an easy challenge. When I was trying to do things for the government with carbon sequestration or carbon capture and sequestration, I wanted to have a way to explain to people what it means to be emitting 32 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. And the number is 32, give or take some. And I ran across something from George Marshall policy in Houston, which equated a gigaton to roughly 500,000 Houston Astrodomes. So to give you a sense of scale, and I think scale is very important, 32 gigatons is 14 million astrodomes of CO2 we need to take care of every year. As we do it, we have to guarantee that the solution we develop doesn't lead us to an unintended consequence of toxic waste, in my opinion. One of the technologies that's currently used is an amine capture system that was developed for enhanced oil recovery. It has problems. The byproducts of the reaction of CO2 with amines is quite toxic. Whether we leave CO2 in our atmosphere or we learn to sequester it underground, we're doing an experiment with our planet. And I think we have to think about that very seriously. There's recent work Dr. Sachs mentioned. There are 2 things from Penn State. I'll just mention one that was done by DeCanto and Pollard and published in Nature. They talked about the Antarctic ice melting and what the impact would be of that. In that, they say there's a potential to increase sea level by 1 meter. And if you're not used to meters, that's 3 feet, 3 inches, roughly, by the end of the century, and to accelerate the rise in sea level more, 15 meters by 2500, if emissions continue unabated. The second part of their statement is equally important for us to understand. The reason once ice starts melting and cracking that it melts faster is you have more surface area to volume. The ocean doesn't have much surface area. As we warm the ocean, it will take longer for it eventually to go to normal temperatures. And they talk about it as really millennia to get the ocean back down to normal. Now, having said all that, I do it because I think people don't fully understand the scale of the challenge we face with energy. I am a scientist. I believe in technology, and I'm actually optimistic that we can do this. We have to be smart about it. We have to watch unintended consequences, but I think we can do it. And I want to read to you something from 1898. I don't mean to equate this to the challenge we face today, but I think it's part of history. History, and the first International Urban Planning Conference was held in New York City in 1898. It was driven by desperation over horse manure. We laugh, but it's true. There were statements in the London Times and across the world that by 1950, every city would be buried under 9 feet of horse manure. Now, I really don't want to equate these, but it's where I get some hope that technology enhances our lives. As we advance in technology, I think we get better lives. The automobile solved this problem. Now we have other problems as a result of it. I think if we're smart and we work together, we can solve this problem with energy and with poverty, and if we pay attention to unintended consequences, make this a much better place. So, having said my piece, I want to introduce the panel who are more distinguished than I am and look forward to their comments. I have Anthony Annett is a climate change and sustainable development advisor at the Earth Institute, Columbia University, and Religions for Peace. He works in the intersection of ethics, religion, and economics, and is a specialist in Catholic social teaching. He has acted as an advisor to the Pontifical Council for Justice, Peace on economic topics and co-authored remarks delivered by Dr. Carolyn Wu, who's from Notre Dame, at the launch of the encyclical of Laudato Si. Chris Barrett is the Deputy Dean and Dean of Academic Affairs of the College of Business. He's a Stephen B. and James G. Ashley Professor of Applied Economics and Management and an International Professor of Agriculture, all at the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management, as well as Professor in the Department of Economics and a Fellow at the David R. Atkins Center for Sustainable Energy Future at Cornell. He is the chair of the International Section of Agriculture and Applied Economics, and previously served as the president of the Association of Christian Economists, and he is on a variety of boards. At the end, we have Daniel Schrag, who is the Sturgis Hopper Professor of Geology, Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering at Harvard University, Director of the Harvard University Center for Environment, Director of the Harvard Kennedy School Program on Science, Technology, and Public Policy. He's worked on a range of on issues in energy technology and policy, including advanced technologies for low-carbon transportation fuel, carbon capture and storage, and risks and opportunities of shale gas. He's been named MacArthur Fellow in 2000 and has been on the President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology Policy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to them. They will each make an introductory statement. We'll have some discussion, and I want to leave a lot of time for you to ask questions. So thank you.
Can I go first?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Scott, Sarah, everybody for inviting me here. I think it's a great privilege to come to Notre. I keep saying Notre Dame. I should say Notre Dame. I can't stop saying Notre Dame for some weird reason. Where did I get that from? But it's a great privilege for me to be here. I've always wanted to visit this campus, so I was just delighted to get the invitation. I want to use my 10 minutes or so to talk a little bit about sustainability and sustainable development through the lens of Pope Francis' Laudato Si, which I actually regard as a great moral charter for sustainable development. And I find a lot of the criticisms levied against it are just kind of a little not really correct. If you go back to 1893, to the beginning of Catholic social teaching, you have Pope Leo XIII's great encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was a moral response to the challenges of the Industrial Revolution of the time, the enormous injustices, violations of dignity, huge gaps between rich and poor that characterized the huge, unprecedented economic and social transformations of the Industrial Revolution. Pope Leo's Rerum Novarum was a moral response to the challenges of the time, and it was the correct moral response. What he basically said was, the laws of the marketplace might be laws, but there are greater laws. There are more laws that are more ancient and imperious than these market laws. And if you mistreat workers or people, you are basically imposing upon them, you're making them victims of force and injustice, I think is the terms he used. Very strong language. So that was the correct moral response to the challenges of the Industrial Revolution. If you fast forward to the present day, I would argue that Laudato Si plays exactly the same role for 2015 as Rerum Novarum did for 1893. It is the moral response to the challenges of our society today, the challenges of the advanced Industrial Revolution, the challenges of a society which, has a global economy which is about 250 times bigger than it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where the population has risen to 9 billion and rapidly rising, a planet that is getting increasingly small given the scale of human activity. So Pope Francis looks at this from a moral perspective, and I think he actually nails the problem and pinpoints the solution. If you look at what he's doing in chapter 2, he is really talking about what we call the planetary boundaries. The fact that human activity is bumping up and going beyond these vital boundaries that sustain the stability and health and flourishing of all the people on our planet. And a lot of people say, Laudato Si is an encyclical about climate change. If you actually look at chapter 2, climate change is mentioned, and there's some very strong words about it, but the section on biodiversity is a longer section than the section on climate change. He talks about water. He talks about pollution. He talks about all of these issues. He doesn't use the term planetary boundaries, but that's really what he's talking about. And that's why when Jeff Sachs spoke yesterday, he basically said, this is a scientifically accurate chapter, and I would have no hesitation of assigning this to any students of ecology because it's exactly right. And this is because, Pope Francis is guided by the wisdom of some of the world's greatest scientists, and for that we can thank the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy, who's sitting in the front row, for all the great wisdom that he brings to this. But I also think that as well as the planetary boundaries, Pope Francis is talking about the moral boundaries of this society, and I think that's crucial. So what is he doing? I actually think he is, in a very audacious manner, taking issue with some of the main pillars of the Enlightenment that have guided our society since the 17th and 18th century. He's criticizing two aspects of it. One, he's criticizing the idea that, number one, that you can use science to achieve possession, mastery, and manipulation of nature. This goes back to René Descartes, and it has really been internalized in the way we approach the natural world. What Pope Francis calls the dominance of the technocratic paradigm, the idea of where he means the logic of gaining control over an external object in a way that kind of brackets any question of value and ethics and morality. So interventions become solely based on utility and efficiency. Since I'm at Notre Dame, I will refer to the great Alistair MacIntyre. I can't resist. And I think, there's an echoes in Alistair MacIntyre's thought when he discussed what he called the emotivist culture, which was a culture where value judgments become mere expressions of preferences. Well, for MacIntyre, what he called the culture of management was was a symbol of this emotivist culture. And what he meant by that is, it's where you have no concept of end, purpose, or telos. You only have the means. And for a management culture, the means becomes the end. Now, when I look at that and you read Laudato Si, I'm like, well, that's exactly what Pope Francis is getting at with this technocratic paradigm. The means become the end. There's no telos, there's no common good. Instead, all that matters is the accumulation of resources, economic growth without limits, the fact that you can keep on doing this without thinking of the consequences or making any value judgments about it. Now, I spent 16 years at the IMF, and I don't want to criticize my colleagues because they're great colleagues, but I think if you want to see a perfect example of the technocratic paradigm, it is in the response to the global financial crisis. The response to the global financial crisis was a technical and technocratic response. Let's have a fiscal stimulus. Let's use quantitative easing. Let's have better capital and leverage ratios on big banks. They're all fine. I have no problem with any of those policies. But they missed the root of the problem. That, they missed the problem that this was a crisis, not just of a technical failure. It was a crisis of values, and it was a crisis of ethics. And this, I think, is the problem with the technocratic paradigm. It allows you to kind of bracket these important issues, and if you're not careful, you go down the wrong direction. And if you're really not careful, it means that, as Pope Francis says, technology will serve power and wealth rather than the common good. So that's his very profound criticism of the first pillar of the Enlightenment. He also criticizes the second pillar of the Enlightenment, which is the supremacy of individual autonomy and individual freedom as the summum bonum, as the common good. And ever since the Enlightenment, from Hobbes and Locke all the way through to Rawls and Nozick and the modern liberal thinking, we have lost the idea of the common good. And this is a profound anthropological failure, because it assumes that the human being is a autonomous, self-interested individual. And we as Catholics don't believe that. We believe that we're actually relational persons. We are beings in relation. And again, I'll do my Notre Dame name dropping. I will name drop Jacques Maritain, whose work on personalism did great work on that. But we're not autonomous individuals. We're relational persons. We find meaning and purpose through our relationships, through our purpose. It's eudaimonia, it's Aristotle. But we have this idea that we are unencumbered selves. And this has profound implications for how the economy works. One of my favorite quotes is from Pope Pius XI, who referred to collectivism and individualism as the twin rocks of shipwreck. So if you criticize Soviet collectivism, good for you, but you should equally criticize an economy that's based on individualism and libertarianism. They're both the twin rocks of shipwreck. And Pius went on to say, economic life cannot be left to a free competition of forces. From this spring has risen the poison spring of the evil individualistic spirit. That might be one of my all-time favorite quotes of Catholic social teaching. If you're ever in need of a good quote and you're in argument with somebody, use this quote. It always works. Because it's from a pope. You can't criticize a pope. So that's where and Pope Francis really builds on this tradition when he talks about the anthropological error that leads to a seedbed of collective selfishness and a self-centered culture of instant gratification. Now, this morning we heard mention in the economic world that, self-interest comes from original sin, and, original sin is always with us. I agree with that, but my challenge I want to pose is, why do we say in all aspects of life we should strive to overcome sin, but in economics we should embrace sin? There's something really... that kind of doesn't really make much sense to me, either as a Catholic or as an economist. So what is the, I mean, so when Pope Francis criticizes the market, what is he doing? He's not, I mean, really the market is simply a way for people to come together to satisfy mutual needs and mutual benefit. That's really all it is. It's not rocket science. The problem is when you overlayer that with these dubious ideologies that come from this, what Francis calls the bondage of individualism and the technocratic paradigm. So the problem is not the market, it's the deified market, the magical conception of the market. You know, a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. That's the problem. Why is it a problem? It's a problem because, one, it leads to exclusion, a throwaway culture. My favorite quote from Pope Francis is, "Let us say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality, where money rules rather than serves." I'm going to use my gestures here. That economy kills, that economy excludes, that economy destroys Mother Earth. And that economy is the economy which we unfortunately live in today. We can have a better economy than that. And that's the economy, I think, that's underpinned by the values of sustainable development that Jeff so eloquently spoke about earlier on today. But the current economy, based on these assumptions, is not capable of bringing about sustainable development because it puts profit first, especially short-term profit, which is dreadful for the poor and the economy of exclusion, but it's also dreadful for nature, for sustainability, for biodiversity, for ecosystems. All of this stuff, the current market economy doesn't really work. So while economic growth on these assumptions does do great things, and let's give credit where it's due, we owe a lot for the decline in poverty from 2 billion in 1990 to about 1 billion today. A lot of that is due to economic growth. Not all, but a lot of it is. But economic growth cannot bring about sustainable development. It does not give you social inclusion, and it does not give you environmental sustainability. So we need sustainable development. We need to reduce poverty, restore dignity to the excluded, and protect the earth. These are the things I'm quoting directly there from Laudato Si. And you know, it's about integral and sustainable human development. As we know, integral human development from Pope Paul VI is about the whole person and every person. Development in all dimensions, and for every single person, no exclusion, no exclusion. It's about living well, Pope Francis says, finding meaning, destiny, dignity, living as God wants us to live. And of course, the sustainable dimension means this encompasses future generations. It also encompasses all of creation. It's a more expansive notion of the common good. It's the common good not only today, but the common good across all of space, all of time, all of creation. It's a thicker notion of solidarity. And solidarity, not self-interest, is the defining, animating principle of the economy of Catholic social teaching. So I think that's really the main point I want to make. I think that the principles of sustainable development, in my view about it is, we can no longer just look at development as economic development, economic growth. From now on, because the 196 nations of the world last September told us that that's what they were promising to do, we need to look at not only economic growth and development, but also social inclusion, environmental sustainability. This inoculates us against the problems that Pope Francis raised. It inoculates us against the dangers of individualism and the dangers of the technocratic paradigm. So I'll end up by quoting Pope Francis again. It's about overturning the myths of modernity, individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, our market about rules. It's about realigning economic progress and moral progress. And that matters for us as economists, scientists, just as much as matters. It's not just for the theologians, it's for all of us in the area of sustainable development. Thank you.
It's a formidable task to follow an economist who can quote from popes and who can reference Notre Dame theologians and philosophers. So I am clearly in over my depth here. But I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Mary, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Scott and team, for pulling together a very impressive couple of days. I've enjoyed the morning's discussions and look forward to further discussions with you all. So I'm a development economist. My own research focuses primarily on poverty and food insecurity problems in rural areas, mainly in very poor rural areas of Africa, to a lesser degree in Asia, and the relationship between the poor and the natural environment that supports their livelihoods. So I come at these questions of sustainability from that very particular context, as an economist who works in specific sorts of communities. So when I approach the question of sustainability, I approach this as an economist, and economists have a definition of sustainability, which actually I think is quite consistent with what a Catholic definition of sustainability, were such a thing to exist, might be. And that is, sustainability is when we have non-decreasing standards of living over time. So non-decreasing standards of living over time, that nobody should have to see their children or grandchildren living a less desirable life, floating back to Carol Graham's comments earlier, that the happiness or the broader sense of self-actualization, the broader satisfaction with one's choice sets, et cetera, the capabilities and entitlements, that those are maintained over time. Now, that's consistent with Catholic social teaching in that the Catechism talks about the common good as always being oriented towards the progress of persons, that it's the order of persons always trumps the order of things. So that sustainability is ultimately about taking care of people, all people. Now, why is this a concern? The concern originates because the well-being of people depends fundamentally on the well-being of the planet, that we are not living in isolation from the biophysical systems that support us, and environmental degradation is all around us in many forms: climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, deforestation, you name it. There are lots of different manifestations of environmental degradation. And in particular, several forms of environmental degradation risk pushing us past irreversibilities that really threaten our ability to maintain standards of living over time. So if you live in a coastal city in Bangladesh and sea levels rise by 5 meters, it's going to be very hard for your progeny to maintain their standards of living. So it's precisely these tipping points in the environment that pose the greatest risk. And the most troubling part about that is that we are at fault, is that environmental change that originates from natural oscillations typically isn't of grave concern to us. It's anthropogenic environmental change that is of concern to us. It's the damage we're doing to ourselves and to our grandchildren that is of greatest concern. And that's the beauty of Laudato Si to me. It's the Pope's call to our moral obligation to accept responsibility for the damage we are doing to the planet, for the damage that risks doing to our children and our grandchildren, and to the less fortunate around the world, and then calling particular attention to how the poorest communities in the world bear relatively little responsibility for these risks, yet they shoulder a disproportionate share of the cost and risk associated with irreversible environmental change. The other really challenging piece of sustainability is that anthropogenic environmental degradation arises principally from two things: income growth that increases our consumption, especially our consumption of non-renewables, and population growth, which is also a manifestation of improvements in standard of living, that we live longer than our parents used to, that our children are more likely to survive than was true 2, 3, 4 generations ago. And it's population and income growth, these reflections of improved standards of living that have a feedback effect on the environment that we need to manage better. Technology is the principal means by which we try to manage better the consequences of improving standards of living for us, so that we can marry intergenerational equity concerns with intragenerational equity concerns. So we can improve standards of living for today's poor so that they can expect a longer life, so that their children can expect a still longer life, and that they can enjoy increased standards of living compared to today without damaging the homes on which they fundamentally depend, the natural homes on which they depend. So why does sustainability matter most to those of us especially concerned about deep and persistent poverty? I would submit that there are 3 big reasons. The first is the Pope's observation that the environmental changes that are exogenous to the poor, meaning they really have virtually no responsibility for these consequences, for these challenges that are arising, have disproportionate impact on them. Climate change is the poster child here, but this applies equally to air pollution. The urban poor of China's cities are not the ones who are causing the bulk of the suspended particulates in air that is damaging their children's lungs. It's the relatively wealthy who are consuming the electricity and driving the vehicles. So the poor wind up bearing disproportionately the costs of damage that they are typically contributing to very little. This is very obvious if you just think back to post-Katrina and the images of New Orleans and those who were suffering from the flooding that inundated New Orleans. It wasn't the high-income neighborhoods of New Orleans that were underwater and rioting and facing really grim circumstances. It was the poorest slums of New Orleans. Same is true whenever floodwaters come into Bangladeshi cities or Mumbai or other coastal developing areas. The areas where I work are primarily arid and semi-arid. I do a lot of work with pastoralists with extensive grazing systems in dry lands, especially in East Africa. And in those areas, we're seeing increasingly severe weather events, increased frequency of very severe drought, and that sort of weather extreme is causing a collapse of systems that have evolved gradually over time to systems that have natural fluctuations, but people could recover from droughts in the past. But now that droughts hit more frequently and with greater severity, increasingly people are unable to recover from the livestock mortality associated with droughts. And we're seeing a steady collapse of several pastoralist systems into geographic poverty traps, where everybody is collapsing into a same low-level standard of living, which is quite troubling. We're seeing similar sorts of things in coastal communities where there's overfishing. And increasingly, people are relying on destructive means of harvesting marine life because it's so hard to find enough fish to be able to take care of your family. So you resort to ever more desperate measures to extract the sea life that remains that is harvestable, but in doing so, you damage the habitat on which the next generation of fish will depend. This is a real problem that we see that the poor are living in the places where the consequences of climate change are likely to be greatest, in coastal areas and in dry lands. It's a special challenge for the poor who rely disproportionately on natural resource-based livelihoods, for farmers and herders and fishermen and foresters, because they're especially vulnerable to climate change. They're especially vulnerable to changes induced by pollution of various sorts. But it's also a special challenge to the poor because the food system is arguably the economic sector with the greatest vulnerability to climate change, and especially to increasing demands on water. The food system, as we saw in 2008-9, again in 2011, can generate very rapid spikes in food prices. And the poor spend a disproportionately large share of their incomes on food, thus are disproportionately vulnerable to the market shocks that originate from climate or other shocks. I'm not suggesting that I think the 2008 food price spike was driven by drought in Australia and the US. I think the evidence is pretty clear it was largely other factors. But it was compounded by supply-side shocks that originate with weather. And the risks of increasing food demand at the same time as we start having increasing challenge extracting enough water to support growing agriculture in Asia and Africa, which is where agriculture has to grow. More than 80% of future demand growth in food is going to come in Asia and Africa because of population and income growth and urbanization. And more than 80% of food in the world is consumed in the country in which it's grown. Trade is very helpful at the margin, but food is the ultimate local good because of its very high weight to value ratio. It's expensive to transport food for long distances. It's expensive to preserve it. It's expensive to refrigerate it. So food gets traded over relatively short distances compared to manufactured goods. As a result, because food demand growth is in today's low and middle income countries of Africa and Asia, the growth in food productivity has to occur at the same geographies. And those are the geographies that are especially threatened by some of the world's environmental challenges today. But the last part of why environmental change is especially, environmental degradation, is especially interesting and challenging for those of us concerned with the rural poor in the developing world is that we also have to admit their own complicity in environmental degradation. It's important to not be overly romantic. The poor are agents of environmental degradation, not just victims of environmental degradation. I've spent a lot of time working with herders who have no qualms whatsoever about wiping out wildlife. I spend lots of time with farmers who systematically mine their soils and who pollute quite actively, and understanding even the consequences of their actions. Why do they do this? They do it because the choices they have available to them are frankly lousy. And in the language of the economics of poverty traps, there's a self-reinforcing set of incentives here where the behaviors that are temporarily optimal for them lead them to do damage that leaves them with lousy options in the future, and the system replicates itself. So that's why we see farmers not investing in sustaining their soils, and soil mining is an enormous loss of wealth in Africa today and poses great risks, especially aggravated by climate change, because water retention capacity of degraded soils is going to be a really major problem for African farming systems in the future. So what are the biggest challenges? How do we address this? First and foremost, I agree utterly with Mary. We've got to invest in technologies. We can come up with solutions to these problems. So developing cultivars that use water more wisely, developing breeds of livestock that are more drought tolerant, developing better energy sourcing methods so that we can produce both liquid fuels and electricity off-grid in rural areas, put the lights on for school children so that they can get to school and get off of the farm and stop having to keep dividing, subdividing, still subdividing further an already small farm, which only condemns to soil mining. We need to be able to address these challenges, and we can only do it through technology. But the other challenge is political will. Here I'll beg to differ with Tony. I have no particular problem with markets, as you may have heard. Although I spend my time doing research on poverty, I also run a business school, which seems very puzzling to some people until you recognize that the poor depend inordinately on markets. They depend upon markets to get their food. They depend upon markets to sell their labor. And understanding how markets work and getting them to work well is one of the great challenges of development. The problem is not markets. The problem is how we run markets. And that's an issue of political will. Markets are just a means of exchange. We can set up means of exchange that are entirely driven by administrative fiat, and we know that doesn't work any better. These expressions of exchange merely reflect the original sin intrinsic to each of us. What we need is the political will to overcome our short-termism, to overcome our avarice, to overcome our self-centeredness. And we see very little in the way of impulses in the body politic to help with that, unfortunately. So anticipating Scott's going to ask us at the end, what are the concrete steps forward for a Catholic research university? Let me plant my flag in the ground first. I think there are three fundamental things that a great Catholic research university like Notre Dame needs to do. The first is to help us all be in community with others, especially to learn from and about the poor. Let's face it, people who get to come to Notre Dame as faculty, staff, or students are not poor. We are privileged. And it's very hard for us to fully understand the lives of and to learn from the lives of, and therefore to help the poor until we're able to be in community with them. So some of the sorts of programs that you run here that offer students the opportunity to spend authentic time in communities and really learn from and work in solidarity with the poor are incredibly important for the very reasons Tony was articulating so nicely. Second is to deepen our relationship with the natural world, which we still struggle to understand. I'm an economist, I'm not a scientist, but I try to spend as much time as I can around natural scientists. Part of that is an economist's belief that at the margin I learn more when in the areas in which I know least. But the other part of it is that the economic system fundamentally rests on the biophysical system. And the more we understand how nature works and what the feedback is between people and nature, the more likely we are to be able to develop effective technologies and minimize unintended consequences that are potentially threatening. In particular, I think a focus on coupled natural and human systems is really central to developing curriculum that are very useful going forward in addressing sustainability problems. And finally, just continuing to push the courageous pursuit of truth. We live in an era where people can put anything they like on the internet and it becomes true simply because it's there. And we need to foster inquisitive and intrinsically skeptical minds that are willing to interrogate what they see, ask themselves, is this true, and to stand up for truth wherever they find it, whether it is popular, whether it is profitable, whether it is politically palatable. And this is the fundamental message of the Gospels, is that we need to pursue truth and in solidarity. So I think the challenges of sustainability are great. I think that they are manageable, but we really need to invest in the political will, the pursuit of truth, the cultivation of a generation prepared to dig in where my generation has failed, and largely to develop the technologies we'll need to solve these problems.
Thank you, Chris and Anthony and Mary. It's really a pleasure to be here on this panel with you, and thanks to Scott and Sarah for inviting all of us. I'm going to speak to you as a climate scientist, as a geologist, who's also spent a lot of time thinking about not just the climate problem, but what to do about it, how to think about energy technology, and ultimately energy policy. And through over the last 18 years or so, I've sort of been a disciple of Jeff Sachs, learning about international development as well. Here's what I want to tell you about. As a scientist, I'm not going to tell you about climate science. I think that's not really the purpose of our panel. I will tell you that I don't tend to like to use the word sustainability. Not because it isn't a good word, but just because it's come to mean so many different things that I find it confusing. I find it couples a lot of different things. And I want to talk to you about climate, not because climate is the most important environmental problem. In fact, often it's the least important. And here, let me explain what I mean. If you lived a few hours away from here in Flint, Michigan, I promise you climate change wouldn't be the environmental problem you'd be worried about. For the last 2 years, your children would be drinking water with lead from the pipes that are all around us, but they had been on Detroit water where additives protected their water from lead, and they switched because of financial concerns to a more corrosive water system that dissolved the lead and brought it into their children's bodies. And by the way, lead in drinking water in children is so harmful to brain development. It is almost scarily predictive of disruptive behavior, of high school dropout. It's extraordinary if you actually look at the data, how serious a problem lead is in terms of brain development. As a parent, I can tell you it's very frustrating. We take care of our kids, we read to them, we worry about them at school, and yet it turns out the most important thing we can do is keep them from getting lead in their bodies. Remarkable. So why is climate different? I would say the reason I care about climate change, the reason I've really devoted my life to this issue as a scientist, is because it's almost an existential issue. It's never the most pressing thing, but that's because of the time scale of it. I'm a geologist, and I think about a range of time scales from billions of years to the future. And I can tell you that the time scale of climate change is long. And very, very seldom will climate change be the most important thing in your life. And yet, it is persistent and profound. And future civilizations and future generations will look back at us with shock and wonder at how we could possibly make the decisions we're making today. That's what troubles me about climate change. Let me talk a little bit about energy technology, because I've been thinking a lot about what to do about climate change. Ultimately, climate change is a problem of using fossil fuels. And fossil fuels have fueled unbelievable economic growth. It's also allowed for population growth, although the scale of that is a bit dwarfed by economic growth. Over the last 150 years, and I'll get the numbers wrong, but basically, population has grown about tenfold, whereas economic growth, GDP, world GDP has grown between 40 and 50-fold. So, yes, population is a huge problem, but economic growth is at a different scale. For many years, I've taught a course where the students in the class have to design a low-carbon economy, both for the world and for the United States. I give them the problem that President Obama has said we're going to be committed to an 80% reduction by 2050, and they have to design that. Sector-specific, so they have to look at the transportation sector, and the residential sector, and the commercial sector, and the industrial sector. And it's very, very challenging. Turns out, it's actually impossible. As a pragmatist, I can tell you that there is no chance that the US is going to reduce its CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. When you do the calculation, the amount of physical infrastructure you have to build is extraordinary. Now, I completely agree with what Mary said, that ultimately technology is the essential part of the solution. And here is the paradox of climate change, that technological innovation is absolutely critical to solving this problem. We really cannot do it with the technology we have today. I decided not to show any slides, but there is one slide I wish I could have shown you. It's a cartoon from Vanity Fair from 1861. And it's a beautiful artist sketch of a cartoon of the whales celebrating, having a grand ball to celebrate the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania. Where I'm from in Massachusetts, our energy industry was hunting whales. That was our energy source. It's extraordinary. Now, I think there's an important lesson. It's not just a funny cartoon. It's actually important to look at because it's important to remember that we didn't stop hunting whales because we cared about the whales. We stopped hunting whales because oil was better, cheaper, and we switched because of that. But that's a very interesting story because there are many people in my field who say, well, the point is that technological innovation, therefore we need to encourage a free market where people can be entrepreneurs and get rich and make money with new technologies and create businesses. I just came back from LA. I was at Stanford not so long ago. Stanford epitomizes this culture. As a university, it's all about startups. Faculty have 2 or 3 startups apiece. That's the nature of the culture. When I graduated from college, Tom Wolfe, the author, gave the commencement address. He had just written Bonfire of the Vanities. And he used the term that I always remember, the term plutography. It's funny because back in 1988, when I graduated from college, it doesn't seem like that was such the height of plutography, but the term plutography refers to the depiction of wealth. He talked about magazines like Architectural Digest, which was supposedly bought by people who were appreciated fine architecture. But in fact, what they really were about was looking at houses of rich people. We fetishize wealth. And by the way, 1988 was nothing. Millionaires then. Today, billionaires. Our culture has been transformed, and it's not just in the US, it's true in China, it's true all over the world, it's true in India. People who have skyscrapers as their personal residences. We become obsessed with these people. I sit on President Obama's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology. Several of these people are my colleagues there. Eric Schmidt from Google, for example. And Eric's a wonderful guy, but we have just, as a culture, these people have become idols for our young children. They want to go to Stanford and get rich and be like Bill Gates or be like Eric Schmidt, be like the Google twins, and ultimately become billionaires and become philanthropists. And that's somehow the ultimate goal. So this obsession with wealth and this technological innovation, I think, are strongly coupled. And to me, this is actually where there's another path. There was a beautiful paper written, or beautiful paragraph in a paper written by a friend of mine named Andy Hoffman, who teaches at the business school at the University of Michigan. Andy made an analogy between climate change and slavery in the US and Europe. And this is controversial. I've gotten in trouble with this quote once because some people think that it's belittling slavery somehow, and I mean that in no way. And I don't mean to say that slavery is abolished everywhere in the world. It's certainly not. But what Andy Hoffman said, in essence, was that like the 18th century view of slavery, where the majority of people, for example, if you went into a pub in London in 1750, and you were an abolitionist and talked about slavery as a moral problem, people would look at you strangely. It wasn't a moral issue. It was an economic issue. Slavery was in the Bible. It just wasn't considered a moral issue. And yet that framing changed where it became a moral issue. It's hard for us to imagine today that in 1860, before the US Civil War, a majority of people, even in the Northeast, the abolitionists were a little bit extreme. And even if you look at Abraham Lincoln's speeches through the course of the Civil War, he evolved, where it went from being an economic challenge with some moral overtones to being fundamentally a moral issue. John Brown was considered a freak terrorist, and he was suddenly, they were singing his name marching into battle. That was a big transition, and it happened very quickly. Let me call. So how do we put this together? And this is what I want to challenge us to think about. I really do believe technological innovation and technology is the solution. To solve climate change, it's not like the internet. It's not like biotechnology. It involves steel and cement. It involves massive infrastructure, and it has a long time scale. It's a huge problem. I'm optimistic that we can do it, although we will still suffer greatly from climate change. We will need to, because that's going to be the motivation to solve the problem. But here's what we need to do. We need to think about technology and innovation for social good. And I want to read from Laudato Si just very briefly, because to me, this is where I think the Pope and all of his advisors really nailed it. From paragraph 107, we have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. Decisions which may seem purely instrumental are in reality decisions about the kind of society we want to build. And then finally, 194, put simply, it is a matter of redefining our notion of progress. A technological and economic development which does not leave in its wake a better world and an integrally higher quality of life cannot be considered progress. I think the essence of this, when we think about World War II, for example, people in the US sacrificed, innovated, because they were threatened. This was warfare, and it was partly nationalism. We like to think that we were in the moral high ground, and I believe we were. But people weren't innovating for profit. They were innovating for the common good. That's what we need to bring back. I think the model of the Googles and the Facebooks, applying that to this problem of climate change, is actually not going to lead us towards the solution. Somehow we have to put aside this fetishism of wealth and think about innovation for the purposement of a common good. And I see that in my students. I see that desire to go and work on solar technology, or figuring out how to manage wind and solar, or think about some advanced new technology that can help solve these problems. Not because they want to be billionaires, but because they really want to solve these grand problems of society. And Scott, if there's anything I would say Notre Dame should think about, it's how to help your students think about the world in that context. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I think I want to open it up to the audience now, because we have only about 15 minutes before we have to break for lunch. So,
thank you. All the three speakers gave very inspiring 10 minutes. I had just two questions. I speak as a human being, which is obvious, and also as an economist, which is not that obvious because you can't, it's not written on me. Human beings, Chris, you mentioned that it's all about human welfare. And I wonder if we should also be caring about whales for their own sake. And focusing too much on humans, I think, leads to this way of we use nature as an instrument, which Dr. Annett talked about. So I wonder if human development stresses too much about humans. Of course, I understand where you're coming from. The second is about economics. I noticed that Dr. Annett said there's the economic and the social inclusion. You talked a lot about economics and trade-offs, and then there was discussion of economics and morals. I always thought of economics as improvements in the well-being of the world, not about wealth, not about income. So I wonder if we should allow economics to be defined in a particular way and accept it, and then say we've got to fight economists. No, economists have to change, I think, too.
Sure. So I couldn't agree with you more on top of it. I think most economics has changed radically. I mean, if you look at those who've won the Nobel Prizes in economics over the last 15, 20 years, it's people like Angus Deaton and Amartya Sen and others who've tried to help us to understand much better what does it really mean to improve the human condition, not just how do we make more money off of Wall Street. There's a little bit of a caricature of economics out there that is increasingly at odds with the reality of the discipline, which frankly is our own fault as economists, because I don't think we do a very good job of teaching introductory economics the way most of us think about practicing economics as researchers. That gets to a much deeper point about what is it we're trying to describe in modern economics. If we're trying to describe how people go about trying to produce what motivates them to make the choices that they make, because ultimately economics is the study of the science of choice under scarcity, either in micro or in aggregate form. I think the reason why we're often deemed the dismal science is we just reflect and accept. We don't champion, but we accept our very fallen nature. And behavioral economics, which is one of the central pieces of modern economics, linking psychology with more traditional forms, is all about present bias. It's all about why people fetishize wealth, that we position ourselves against others and we think we're worse off suddenly just because somebody else got much better off. And it's all of these sorts of behavioral irregularities, if you will, that the traditional economic models didn't accommodate, that are just part of our fabric as humans, as fallen individuals. And in describing the consequences of the behaviors we have, we deservedly get castigated for describing things that we aren't too pleased about in economic behavior because it's human behavior. But we have to come to terms with that. That's why I emphasize we must be careful not to romanticize the poor as purely victims of environmental degradation. They are also agents of environmental degradation, and we have to understand why. And we have to figure out how can we help them to take better care of themselves as they would like to if the incentives and the constraints were just better. So I completely agree with you. We need to advance a better, broader framework of teaching and understanding economics. I think the research frontier is already there. We're just failing to do it very well in the classroom.
It's right there.
I can just add to that. I agree with that also as an economist, but I'm probably a little bit more radical. I actually think that, the idea that ethics has been stripped out of economics is actually a fairly recent development. It was never, from Aristotle through Aquinas all the way through Adam Smith, virtue ethics was kind of central to economics. The real problem came with the neo-utilitarians like Pareto. Pareto once actually famously said that, to say I should have ethics in economics is like saying, why doesn't chess listen to culinary arts? They're completely different. And I think that's part of the issue. Like, a lot of economists would say, well, we should all be ethical. We should definitely be ethical. I have no problem with that. But it's not an economic issue. And I think that's the fundamental challenge we need to get past. And the anthropological assumptions of Homo economicus, one, self-interested, two, only interested in material gains over eudaimonistic ideas, and three, that we have preferences that cannot be changed, and we are forbidden from actually passing value judgments on whether those preferences are good or bad. This goes against the fundamental nature of the human being, and it's a very modern, recent development that I think we have to fix. So I would go much more deeper.
I just want to, as I listened, I thought, wow, I'm glad I'm a scientist. Because as big as the challenges are in science, and I agree we're not going to meet the goals the president set, what I hear common from the three of you is we need to change the values of society. Even though we're talking about economics or technology, underlying all of it is how do we change the fundamental values of our developed society. And to me, that seems very daunting, much more so than the challenges we face in technology. So I'd like you to comment.
I think that's what Andy Hoffman was trying to get at. And I have hope in this, frankly, because of the example of American slavery. Think about how quickly that view of the world changed, where people, after 1864 or 5, couldn't imagine slavery other than a moral issue. Mm-hmm. It's hard for us to even think about how you could not see it that way. That switch happened so fast. So the question is, what is the event or set of events or chain reaction that ultimately will lead us to have that same transition? And I think Andy's partial point was that if we're actually going to succeed at this, yes, technological innovation is how we're going to do it. And economics is going to be absolutely critical in terms of the currency, the mechanisms through which we actually incentivize behavior. But underlying those economic decisions are policies that ultimately do reflect our values. Mm-hmm. And, those values, luckily, can actually change very quickly. We are not stuck where we are today. And I think that's the hopeful part.
But I'll ask Scott's question. If you had one thing to do, how do we do that? And then I'll...
Well, I'm inspired by things, for example, down the road from me, MIT, there's an entire group who works on specifically technological innovation for the poor. Now, they are not motivated by money, they're motivated by solving big problems. And I see students really running to that. But to me, coupling science, technology, and economics into a framework that thinks about social good as a target for innovation and science and technology, I think that's something that really hasn't ever been tried. What better place to do it? Following, I think, the inspiring words from Laudato Si. I think that would be a very interesting experiment to try. And how you would do that, I don't know exactly, but that's why it's a good challenge.
Did you?
Yes, on the question of climate change and economics, I think climate change is the greatest market failure that we ever know. And climate change has really been externalizing the internal cost of climate. So we are externalizing in the atmosphere and the oceans and the forest system and in the soil. So this externalization is not clearly understood in the initial stages. At this point in time, climate change has become probably the greatest justice issue in global justice paradigm. So I think we are onto that, and till that is clearly understood, one has to look why we are not being able to do. The other question is science. Good science is absolutely necessary for good policy, but US has shown us that that doesn't work. Good science doesn't make good policy in the US in climate change, at least. Some bits do, most of it doesn't. And that has tremendous impact on the global system. The withdrawal from Kyoto Protocol to everything else that went through are those issues. And I think it's time that we have to really get into it. Of course, Obama administration has shown some great examples, and you say rightly that it will be very difficult to reach the 80% target that one is claiming. But the issue of the extreme events that is already there and going to come is going to interfere and going to be the greatest threat to the elimination of poverty, far bigger than the economic tools or even the science itself, because extreme events are moving so fast to many, many communities, whether it's sea level rise, which is slow onset, but rapid floods, cyclone, typhoons, drought, the whole lot, including now mountain degradation, glacial melt, many of those. So how all that combines in making sure that the policy, the science really addresses or taken seriously in the whole policy domain in across the world, but definitely in the US, and the private sector as well, because much of the economic thinking of solving the poverty issue is that the poor don't have the money to pay all the regulations and systems that economics has designed for us. So we do have some fundamental issues of challenges here. Whether climate change can be brought into a moral issue, that remains whether how our leaders or leaders to be look at it.
Yeah.
It's not a very pretty story what we see in the United States.
Thank you very much. Let me challenge you on two things. I agree with most of what you said, but let me just challenge you on two things. One is I actually don't like to frame climate change as a market failure, not because there aren't market failures involved, but because I actually think that gives too much leverage to viewing this as purely an economic problem. There are lots of market failures but that's only because ultimately these aren't market decisions. We didn't build highways across the United States because of a free market decision. We didn't decide to put subways in New York City because of a market. These were complicated political decisions that had many motivations. In the case of the highways, it was really motivated by concerns about nuclear weapons and defense. And there are many examples of this. So these decisions aren't all free market decisions anyway. So there's an illusion that there is somehow a free market, and it's not. It's more complicated than that. We make political decisions about the infrastructure we build all the time. And so this isn't all that different. I would also push back on the failure of the US. I would say science and policy is difficult. Our failure to deal with climate change has to do with the fact that it's expensive and people don't want to. That's the problem. And it's true, by the way, not just in the US, it's true just about everywhere. There's very few countries I can think of that actually have really done something significant. There's a handful of them. And even the ones that have complicated motivations. So for example, in Germany, they talk about climate change, but in fact it's motivated by their hatred of nuclear power. when it actually starts taking away their automobiles, they reject it handily. And they're actually building more coal plants now because of their high prices. So these are complicated issues. The final thing is, in terms of poverty, I actually think the world has changed a lot in the last decade. For real extreme poverty elimination, actually technology has come a long way. Renewable technologies, if you don't have a grid, if you're in a remote village somewhere in South Asia, actually solar panels are probably your best and cheapest option. That's not the tough problem. So the elimination of extreme poverty, to me, we actually have technological solutions now that are at least very close to competitive, if not competitive. It's not the first 100 or few hundred watts that a person uses. It's going from a few hundred watts to a few thousand watts that's the problem. And here's the tough choice. If you're the Prime Minister of India, you know that as much as you want to build solar panels aren't going to put the hundreds of millions of people who are living in poverty in India, they're not going to help them fast enough. And building coal plants will actually dramatically improve their lives. And yet, building those coal plants will accelerate our path down the road to destruction. That's the real dilemma. And from a perspective of those people in India, there's no question that building those coal plants is a good decision. That's where I'm stuck. It's very difficult. It's where those two interests, it's easy where those two interests align. It's where they're directly in conflict that makes this such a challenge. And that's really what I see.
I think there's also the issue, though, of, when you talk about whether renewables are cost competitive with fossil fuels, we have to understand that fossil fuels are subsidized to the extent of 6.5% of global GDP. That's something like $6 trillion spent subsidizing fossil fuels. If that went away, the global landscape would change dramatically. And why is that? I want to quote from Pope Francis again. There are too many special interests, and economic interests end up trumping the common good and manipulating information so that their own plans will not be affected. In my view, I agree with everything that Dan said, but I think this is the key problem. The key problem is the people who don't want to make any financial losses because of the change that we all need. These are the dark forces that we need to deal with.
I think I've been asked to end this, so unless there's another urgent question, I want to thank all the panelists. Couldn't agree with you more.